Greetings. Last time when I left off the last lecture, Clovis had created a capital in Paris. France had turned into a Catholic country. Charles Martel had defeated um the Muslims and had protected Christendom and Catholicism in France. Your book then talks a bit about the Hundred Years' War, but in your notes, I added something because I wanted to give you a sense that France really had become the premier medieval state even before the Hundred Years' War, and so I gave the date 1328 with Philip VI. The idea that France was a large country, given the time period, about 15 million people, that it was one of the centers of medieval culture, and most importantly, was the most powerful nation on the continent at the time in Europe. So that predated the Hundred Years' War. And I won't bore you with redundancy. We talked about the Hundred Years' War at some length earlier. But remember that the French, in this case, had two lands. I talked about Gascony, the other was Normandy. That both French kings and English kings, remember that the English, the Normans were these French-speaking people, and remember they took over England, and they did not renounce their claims in France, and eventually this led to a devastating conflict, a very lengthy conflict. Um, Now, early in the war, something happened that went beyond the political control of either the French or the English. Um, France becomes the entry point for the Black Death or the bubonic plague. In fact, the plague entered France in Marseille in southern France. And for me, I'm always trying to tell you this stuff's kind of about our history. The French side of my family is from Marseille. So I'm I'm wondering how many people in my family may have died because of the Black Death, but it was awful. The Black Death killed approximately a third of all of the people in France. 40% of people tilling the land died, which certainly undermined that concept of feudalism that I talked about earlier. And in France, the monarchy was given kind of an injection in this case um, of royal absolutism. So the conflict lasted from 1337 to 1453. And at the end of this conflict, the French prevailed. They won this war, and the English had to renounce all of their claims on the continent. The only thing that the English got to keep was Calais and the Channel Islands out in the Mediterranean. So this was an overwhelming victory for the French, for French absolutism, and of course, political development in France remained pretty stable. Various factors contributed to the reinforcement of absolutism, including the 30 Years' War later. Your book talks about Louis XIV, and certainly there is no question that Louis XIV from 1643 to 1715, there is no question that this was the height of French absolutism. In this particular case, France was seen as kind of the cultural center of Europe. Monarchs all across Europe kind of emulated his decadence, if you will. But the problem was that the French kings kind of overplayed their hand. They were involved in frequent wars. Economic mercantilism was not nearly as efficient as Britain, which was very, very quickly moving eventually to a free trade model. And of course, the French Revolution is the response to really the breakdown uh, of political authority. Now, one of the things that's quite intriguing, and I mentioned this earlier, is that, you know, revolutions kind of take different treks, but in many cases, revolutions actually occur when things are beginning to get better. But in the French case, uh, the French had been involved in a couple of devastating wars. The French had been involved in a war that I didn't list in your notes, the 7 Years' War. That was fought with the British, and remember that the result of that conflict was that the French lost Canada to the British. The French also lost lands in what today we would call the Mississippi and Ohio valleys. Um, so, example, Pittsburgh, the French at the start of that war had a French fort named Fort Duquesne. The French were defeated by the British, and the British built a much larger fort called Fort Pitt, which is the genesis of modern day Pittsburgh. So the British not only were the new owners of Canada, but the British also owned all of the land west of the colonies, all the way out to the Mississippi River. And so the French had been devastated by that war. And of course, um, the French decided to get even with the British. I think the thinking in France was, well, if the British are going to cause us to lose our colonies, well, turnabout is fair play, and we are going to make sure that the British lose some of their colonies. And so when the Revolutionary War broke out, the French were all too happy to help the American colonists in their war against Britain. But the result of this was that the French were nearly bankrupted by their support of the colonists, especially after losing the 7 Years' War even earlier. Um, I have in your notes the concept of revolutions usually begin when things are getting better. Now, Ruskin gives credit to a very famous Frenchman, Alexis de Tocqueville, but I want to extend the analysis here and talk a little bit about a man named Ted Robert Gurr. He wrote a book, Why Men Rebel. And essentially, Gurr said that revolutions usually occur when things are getting better, because what we tend to see is that even though things are getting a little bit better, people's expectations are that things are going to get a whole heck of a lot better. And so what develops over time is what Gurr called relative deprivation. If people's expectations are low, then the capacity of the political regime can be low, and the system can be very stable, even though the political system is not functioning very effectively at all. However, if people begin to perceive and believe that things are going to get a lot better and a lot better quickly, and things only get a little bit better, then this notion of relative deprivation sits in. And actually, this is kind of true in France. The French Revolution occurs when things are objectively getting a little bit better, but subjectively, they're not getting much better. And your book chronicles, I think, quite well the devastation of the French Revolution. It was very bloody. It was very horrific. Your book talks about as many, maybe even more, 20,000 people being guillotined during the Reign of Terror. And keep in mind a concept that I introduced to you in the first section. Remember that concept of Praetorianism, that in a lot of societies, when political institutions break down, when political institutions are no longer effective, uh, oftentimes the only stable institution in the country is the military. And so the military takes over and becomes the governing institution in the country. And uh, I talked at some length about the military doing this in Brazil in the 1960s. So this is what Napoleon did. Napoleon set up a coup d'etat and created order and stability for about 15 years. But of course, you know, his political regime ended when he was defeated. The the French Revolution and Napoleon really do chronicle kind of the dual tendencies, right? The French Revolution had promised equality. Um, the first two republics were really unable to deliver any kind of stability at all. The institutions broke down dramatically. And so we get that strong executive officer under Napoleon. Napoleon steps in, uh, really ushers in nationalism throughout Europe. Napoleon had an impact that goes way beyond France. For example, Prussia had been the dominant German state for quite some time. Prussia thought that it was very modern. And when Napoleon went in and defeated the Prussians quite easily in 1807, what it did was it created a rethinking in Prussia that we have to modernize. We have to modernize our bureaucracy, our military. Of course, after Napoleon swept throughout Europe, a whole wave of nationalism struck the continent. We get the creation in the 19th century of a whole variety of nations that demand statehood. So we get new countries like Greece and Belgium. We get the unification of Germany later in the 19th century in three wars to unify that country. The traditional five states of Italy unite into a unified Italy. And so Napoleon gets a lot of credit for this. Ruskin talks about how the aftermath of Napoleon was very important. I would extend that and say that the aftermath of Napoleon is even more significant than Napoleon himself, because certainly Napoleon has a dramatic influence on France. We talked about how conservatives look up to these strong executive figures like Napoleon or like de Gaulle. But the notion of nationalism getting unleashed and Europe being fundamentally transformed by this 19th century wave of nationalism is, in my opinion, probably the longest lasting legacy of Napoleon. So Napoleon is a French figure, but he is also a European figure as well. And certainly when I come back in the next lecture, I am going to sweep ahead to the significance of the Third Republic, because what we are going to see beginning with the creation of the Third Republic is the dominance of republics. But we are going to see a failed republic with the Third and the Fourth Republics. We are going to eventually only see stability in the Fifth Republic, which is often called the de Gaulle model or the de Gaulle Constitution. And I will talk about the significance of the Third Republic in the next lecture. I hope that you're getting something out of these lectures. I know they lack kind of the spontaneity and the humor of the others, but I'm starting to feel a little bit more comfortable giving these.